Dr. Sarah Chen had always known this day would come. She just hadn't expected it to arrive with such bureaucratic coldness, delivered through a sterile holographic message that flickered into existence above her desk in the xenobiology lab aboard Station Kepler 442b. Dr. Chen, the image of Administrator Vexthal began, his four eyes blinking in sequence as was customary for his species. By order of the Galactic Council's Education Oversight Committee, your teaching privileges are hereby revoked. Your services as an instructor at the Interspecies Academy are no longer required. Sarah sat back in her chair, watching the message continue with growing disbelief. The Zephyrian administrator's voice carried that particular tone of superiority that had become all too familiar during her 3 years at the Academy. Your unconventional teaching methods and excessive emotional involvement with students have been deemed detrimental to proper educational standards. Furthermore, your tendency to encourage individual thinking over collective harmony violates several educational protocols established by the Convergence Treaty of 2387. The hologram paused, and Sarah could almost hear the satisfaction in the alien's voice as he delivered the final blow. You have 24 standard hours to vacate your quarters and return to Earth. A transport has been arranged. Do not attempt to contact your students during this transition period. End transmission. The message dissolved, leaving Sarah alone in her lab, surrounded by the research that had consumed her life for the past 3 years. Her hands trembled slightly as she reached for her coffee cup, finding it cold and bitter, much like the taste this news left in her mouth. She had known her methods were controversial, teaching young aliens to question authority, to think critically about their own culture's limitations, to embrace the concept of individual achievement. These weren't exactly popular concepts in a galaxy that prized conformity above all else. But the results spoke for themselves. Her students consistently outperformed their peers. They showed creativity in problem-solving that impressed even the most rigid professors. They developed innovations that had advanced their respective species' technologies by decades. None of that mattered now. Sarah stood and walked to the large viewport that dominated one wall of her lab. Beyond the transparent aluminum, the surface of Kepler 442b stretched out in shades of purple and gold, its twin moons casting strange shadows across alien landscapes. This had been her home, her purpose, her calling. Now it was just another place she was being forced to leave. The sound of the lab door sliding open behind her made her turn. She expected to see security personnel, perhaps even Administrator Vexthal himself coming to escort her off the station. Instead, she found herself looking at a collection of her students, their various species represented in a nervous cluster near the entrance. Zictor, a young reptarian whose scales shifted color with emotion, stepped forward first. His normally green hide showed patches of deep blue, sadness, Sarah knew from her studies. "Professor Chen," he began, his voice carrying the slight hiss that characterized his people's speech. "We heard about the decision. It isn't right." Behind him, Myra 9, a crystalline being from the resonance cluster, chimed in harmonious tones that Sarah's universal translator converted to words. "Your teaching opened new pathways in our thinking processes. The Council fears what we might become." Other voices joined the chorus of support. There was Thok, a massive Gorian whose thick hide and tusks made him look fearsome but whose gentle nature had made him one of Sarah's favorite students. Next to him stood Whisper, a barely visible energy being from the void reaches, whose presence Sarah could only detect through the slight shimmer in the air. "We know they want you gone," said a new voice, and Sarah looked down to see Pip, a small mammalian creature from the outer spiral whose species rarely grew taller than a human child. "But we've been talking, and we've made a decision too." Sarah felt her throat tighten with emotion. "Pip, you can't do anything rash. Your educations are too important." "No," Zictor interrupted, his scales now showing streaks of bright red, determination. "What you taught us is too important. You showed us that intelligence isn't about following predetermined paths. You taught us that each individual has unique value, that questioning authority isn't rebellion, it's growth." Myra 9's crystalline form brightened, casting rainbow patterns on the lab walls. "We learned more in your classes than in all our other courses combined. You didn't just teach us facts, you taught us how to think." Sarah looked around at their faces, such different features from such vastly different worlds, but all showing the same resolve. She felt a pride so fierce it almost overwhelmed her grief at losing this position. The council thinks removing you will solve their problem, Thok rumbled, his deep voice carrying across the lab. They believe we'll return to passive acceptance of their educational mediocrity. Whisper's shimmer intensified, and the universal translator picked up the energy being's thoughts. They underestimate what you've given us. Knowledge once gained cannot be taken away. Sarah found her voice, though it came out rougher than she intended. What are you saying? Pip stepped forward, and despite standing barely 3 feet tall, there was nothing small about the determination in the little being's eyes. We're saying that if the Galactic Council doesn't want humans teaching their children, then maybe their children shouldn't remain under the Galactic Council's authority. The implications of what they were suggesting hit Sarah like a physical blow. You can't mean. We're adults, Zictor said firmly. Under galactic law, we have the right to choose our own educational paths once we reach majority age. Most of us achieved that status months ago. Myra 9's chiming grew more complex, and Sarah caught the undertones of excitement in the crystalline being's voice. We've researched the legal precedents. There are provisions for independent study groups, for alternative educational institutions. You're talking about leaving the academy, Sarah said, hardly believing what she was hearing. Leaving your guaranteed careers, your family expectations, your entire planned futures. Thok's massive shoulders moved in what Sarah had learned was the Gorian equivalent of a shrug. Our families sent us here to learn. We learned that following predetermined paths leads to stagnation. We learned that true growth comes from challenge, from choosing difficult roads instead of easy ones. Whisper's energy pattern shifted, and the translator conveyed a sense of ancient wisdom despite the being's relatively young age. You taught us that humans have a saying, if you want to go fast, go alone. If you want to go far, go together. We choose to go far, Pip added, the small being's voice carrying absolute conviction, with the teacher who showed us what was possible. Sarah felt tears threatening to form in her eyes. The courage these young beings were showing, the sacrifice they were willing to make, the trust they were placing in her, it was both humbling and terrifying. Where would we even go? She asked, her practical mind already racing ahead to the massive logistical challenges such a plan would present. The academy controls our housing, our food, our transportation. We have no resources, no funding, no official support. Zictor's scales shifted to a pattern Sarah had never seen before, complex spirals of gold and silver that spoke of hope mixed with determination. We've been thinking about that too. There are places in the galaxy where independent thinking isn't considered a crime. Frontier worlds where practical skills matter more than proper credentials. Myra 9 chimed in agreement. The Outer Rim territories have mining colonies, research stations, terraforming projects. They need problem solvers, innovators, people who can adapt and think independently. Besides, Thok added with what Sarah was learning to recognize as Gorian humor, they told you to go, they didn't specify where. Sarah walked back to her desk, her mind reeling with possibilities and implications. On the surface, the plan was madness. She would be giving up her career, her pension, her chance to ever work in mainstream galactic education again. The students would be abandoning prestigious degrees, disappointing families who had sacrificed to send them here, and venturing into an uncertain future with no guarantees. But as she looked at their faces, these young beings who had already learned to think beyond the constraints their societies had placed on them, Sarah realized that staying might be the real madness. Here, they would graduate to become obedient cogs in vast governmental and corporate machines. Their creativity would be channeled into approved directions, their innovations filtered through layers of bureaucracy until any trace of original thinking was eliminated. Out there in the wild spaces between the established powers, they could become something new. If we do this, Sarah said carefully, there's no going back. The council will make sure we're blacklisted from any official institution. We'll be on our own. Pip's whiskers twitched in what Sarah had learned was amusement. Professor, you've spent 3 years teaching us that the best discoveries come from going where no one has gone before. Whisper's energy pattern brightened. You showed us that humans became the most adaptable species in the galaxy not by following safe paths, but by taking risks others wouldn't dare. Every great advancement in galactic history came from individuals who refused to accept. That's how things are done, Myra 9 added, the crystalline beings form pulsing with excitement. Zictor stepped closer to Sarah's desk, his scales now showing the deep green of certainty. You taught us that education isn't about receiving knowledge, it's about learning to create knowledge. We can do that anywhere. Thok's laugh was like distant thunder. Besides, the best human innovations happened when you were told something was impossible. Sarah looked around her lab one more time, seeing it now not as a place she was losing, but as a starting point for something unprecedented. Her research could continue anywhere. Her teaching could reach students who genuinely wanted to learn rather than just fulfill requirements. And these brave young beings beside her had already proven they could think beyond the limitations others had set for them. 24 hours, she said finally, her decision crystallizing as she spoke. They gave us 24 hours to pack and leave. Is that enough time? Pip asked, practical concerns mixing with excitement in the small being's voice. Sarah smiled for the first time since receiving the administrator's message. It'll have to be. Besides, humans have a saying about burning bridges behind you. It certainly makes moving forward the only option. She turned to face her students fully, these extraordinary young beings who had chosen to risk everything based on principles she had taught them. They had learned her lessons almost too well. If we're going to do this, Sarah said, her voice growing stronger with conviction, we're going to do it right. This won't be about running away from the Council's authority, it'll be about building something better. The excitement in the room was almost tangible, different from each species but unmistakably shared. They were crossing a line from which there was no return, choosing uncertainty over security, possibility over guarantees. As her students began discussing practical details of their departure, Sarah realized that this moment, this decision to leap into the unknown together, was perhaps the most human thing she had ever done. And she was bringing the galaxy's future with her. The next 18 hours passed in a blur of activity that would have impressed even the most efficient military operation. Sarah had underestimated her students' commitment to their decision, and she was learning that each species brought unique advantages to their escape plan. Myra 9 had accessed the station's data networks with a skill that bordered on artistic. The crystalline being's natural ability to interface with electronic systems meant they could move through the Academy's databases without leaving traces, copying research data, course materials, and, most importantly, detailed star charts of the Outer Rim territories. The Frontier Development Corporation has 17 active terraforming projects in this sector alone, Myra 9 reported, their crystalline form flickering with data streams. Most are understaffed and desperately need qualified personnel. Thok had taken charge of physical logistics, his massive frame and natural strength proving invaluable as he quietly moved equipment and supplies from various labs to a cargo shuttle that Zictor had somehow acquired access to. The Gorian worked with an efficiency that spoke of careful planning. My people built the cargo handling systems on this station, Thok explained when Sarah asked how he knew the service corridors so well. Gorian engineering always includes redundant pathways, very useful for avoiding main traffic routes. Meanwhile, Zictor had proven that his people's reputation for cunning was well-deserved. The young Reptarian had spent hours in the station's administrative sections, his natural chameleon-like abilities allowing him to observe without being noticed. He returned with intelligence that was both encouraging and alarming. The Council's order came directly from the Zephyrian Education Ministry, he reported, his scales shifting to worried patterns. But the timing isn't coincidental. 3 other human instructors on different academy stations received similar dismissals this week. Sarah felt a chill that had nothing to do with the station's climate control. They're removing all human teachers. It appears so, Zictor confirmed. Whatever we represent to them, they've decided it's too dangerous to tolerate. Whisper, the energy being, had been monitoring communications channels throughout the station. Their unique nature allowed them to detect electromagnetic patterns that conventional scanners missed. Security is increasing, Whisper reported through the universal translator. They plan to escort you to the transport personally. They also intend to conduct interviews with your students to ensure no contamination of thinking has occurred. The implications were clear. Once Sarah was gone and the students were interrogated, any chance of escape would vanish. They had one window of opportunity, and it was closing rapidly. Pip had surprised everyone by taking charge of the most crucial element, where they would go. Despite their small stature, the little being had contacts throughout the Outer Rim territories that made Sarah realize how vast the galaxy's underground networks really were. My family runs cargo routes between the frontier worlds, Pip explained, working at a portable communication device that looked impossibly complex. They're not exactly legal routes, but they're reliable. I've arranged passage to Kepler 186F. The mining world? Sarah asked, familiar with the planet's reputation as a rough frontier settlement. Not exactly, Pip grinned, showing tiny sharp teeth. That's what most people think. The mining operations are just a cover. Kepler 186F is actually home to the most advanced independent research facility in this sector. They call it Haven. Sarah's scientific curiosity overcame her anxiety. What kind of research? Myra 9 chimed in excitement. Cross-species technological development, ma'am. They're working on innovations that the major governments have banned or ignored. Faster-than-light communication, gravity manipulation, even consciousness transfer studies. It's where scientists go when their ideas are too dangerous for civilized space, Zichter added, his scales showing patterns of anticipation. Perfect for a group of educational refugees. Thok's rumbling laugh filled the lab. They'll either think we're brilliant or completely insane. Knowing humans, Whisper observed, they'll probably consider those the same thing. As the hours ticked down, Sarah found herself constantly amazed by her students' capabilities. They worked with a coordination that spoke of deep mutual respect and understanding. More importantly, they demonstrated exactly the kind of independent thinking and problem-solving that had gotten her in trouble with the council in the first place. Watching them prepare for their departure, Sarah realized that her real success as a teacher wasn't in the knowledge she had imparted, but in the confidence she had given them to trust their own judgment. With 6 hours remaining before her scheduled departure, they were ready. The cargo shuttle was loaded with essential equipment, research data, and enough supplies to sustain them during the journey to Kepler 186F. More importantly, each student had prepared explanations for their families that emphasized the educational opportunities they were pursuing rather than the authority they were defying. The key, Zichter had explained, is framing this as advancement, not rebellion. Our families want us to succeed. If we can demonstrate that this path offers better opportunities for growth, they'll understand. Sarah hoped he was right. The last thing she wanted was to cause a permanent rift between these young beings and their loved ones. As they made final preparations, an unexpected visitor arrived. Dr. Kethmer, an elderly Centaurian professor who had taught theoretical physics at the Academy for over 4 decades, appeared in the lab's doorway. His 4 arms carried what appeared to be a collection of data storage devices, and his expression was difficult to read. Dr. Chen, he said formally, I came to wish you farewell. Sarah tensed, wondering if the professor had discovered their escape plan. Dr. Kethmer was well respected by the administration, and his word could bring security forces down on them instantly. Instead, the elderly alien stepped into the lab and handed her one of the storage devices. Your research on cross-species psychological development, he explained. I've been following it with great interest. Such work shouldn't be lost to bureaucratic narrow-mindedness. Sarah accepted the device, confused. Professor, I'm not sure what you... Additionally, Dr. Kethmer continued, producing more storage units, I thought you might find value in some theoretical frameworks that the Council has deemed too speculative for official curricula. He handed devices to each of the students, his 4 eyes twinkling with what Sarah was learning to recognize as Centaurian humor. These contain advanced physics concepts, mathematical theorems, and engineering principles that certain governmental bodies consider too dangerous for young minds. I've spent 40 years collecting them. Zichter stepped forward, his scales showing uncertainty. Professor, why are you? Because, Dr. Kethmer interrupted gently, I was young once too. I had a teacher who encouraged me to think beyond accepted limitations. That teacher was forced to leave his position for similar reasons to Dr. Chen's departure. The old professor looked around the group, his expression growing serious. I chose to stay and work within the system. I told myself I could create change from the inside. He paused, and Sarah could see decades of frustration in his posture. I was wrong. The system doesn't change. It absorbs rebels and transforms them into collaborators. He turned to Sarah directly. You're making the right choice, all of you. The galaxy needs individuals who refuse to be absorbed. Whisper's energy pattern shifted to curiosity. You know what we're planning. Dr. Kethmer's laugh was like wind chimes in a gentle breeze. My dear energy being, I helped design the security systems on this station 30 years ago. I've been watching your preparations with admiration. Very thorough, very professional. Sarah felt her heart rate increase. Are you going to report us? Report you for what? The professor asked innocently. A group of students choosing independent study opportunities, a human teacher accepting a research position at a frontier facility. He smiled, showing the pointed teeth characteristic of his species. I see nothing requiring official attention. The relief in the room was palpable, but Dr. Kethmer wasn't finished. However, he continued, I would suggest accelerating your departure timeline. Administrator Vexthal has moved his schedule. He plans to arrive in 3 hours instead of 6. The urgency of their situation snapped back into focus immediately. 3 hours meant they needed to leave within the next 2 hours to have any safety margin. Thank you, Sarah said, meaning it more than she had ever meant anything in her life. Don't thank me yet, Dr. Kethmer replied. What you're attempting is unprecedented. A multi-species group pursuing independent education and research outside governmental oversight. It will be dangerous, difficult, and quite possibly impossible. He paused, looking at each of them in turn. It will also be the most important educational experiment in galactic history. If you succeed, you'll prove that knowledge and innovation don't require institutional approval. You'll demonstrate that diverse minds working together can achieve more than homogeneous groups following predetermined paths. Myra 9's crystalline form brightened with excitement. You think we can actually make it work? Dr. Kethmer's expression grew thoughtful. I think humans have a saying about the impossible just taking a little longer. Dr. Chen has taught you well. You've already proven you can think beyond limitations others accept as absolute. As the elderly professor prepared to leave, he turned back one final time. Remember, he said, the greatest discoveries in galactic history weren't made in prestigious academies or government laboratories. They were made by individuals who dared to ask questions others wouldn't ask, who pursued knowledge others considered too dangerous or too speculative. He paused at the doorway. The Council fears what you represent not because you're wrong, but because you might be right. Prove them correct to be afraid. After he left, the lab fell silent except for the hum of life support systems. The weight of what they were attempting settled over them like a physical presence. They weren't just leaving the academy. They were challenging the fundamental assumptions about how education and research should be conducted in galactic society. 2 hours, Sarah said finally, breaking the silence. 2 hours, Pip agreed, already beginning shutdown procedures on the lab equipment they were leaving behind. As they made their final preparations, Sarah realized that they had already succeeded in one crucial way. They had proven that beings from vastly different species and cultures could work together toward a common goal, could trust each other enough to risk everything on a shared vision. If they could do that here, under pressure and with limited time, what might they accomplish with freedom and resources? The thought both terrified and exhilarated her. In 2 hours they would find out. The cargo shuttle Wanderer had seen better decades, but as they cleared Station Kepler 442b's gravitational influence, Sarah couldn't have cared less about the vessel's aged hull or its tendency to vibrate at certain velocities. They were free. Pip sat at the pilot's controls with the casual confidence of someone born to navigation, their small fingers dancing across instruments that seemed designed for much larger beings. The little pilot had modified the ship's systems to accommodate their stature, and the result was surprisingly effective. Jump to hyperspace in 30 minutes, Pip announced. Once we make the transition, we'll be invisible to Academy sensors. The route to Kepler 186F will take us through 3 systems that don't report to the Galactic Council. Sarah found herself studying her companions as they settled into the journey. Each had brought skills that proved essential to their escape, but more importantly, each had displayed a courage that humbled her. They had given up everything familiar to pursue an uncertain future based solely on educational principles she had taught them. Zichter was monitoring communication channels. his natural ability to process multiple data streams simultaneously making him an ideal intelligence officer. His scales had settled into patterns of concentration, deep blues and greens that indicated focused attention. "No pursuit signals yet," he reported. "Either they haven't discovered our departure, or they're not considering it worth pursuing." Myra 9 had interfaced directly with the ship's computer systems, their crystalline form glowing softly as data flowed between them and the vessel's electronic consciousness. "I'm optimizing our route based on real-time stellar cartography updates. We can shave 6 hours off the journey time." Thok had somehow managed to fit his massive frame into what had once been the cargo shuttle's loading bay, which he had converted into a temporary laboratory space. The Gorian's thick fingers worked with surprising delicacy as he organized the research equipment they had salvaged from the academy. "I've been thinking about our situation," he rumbled, his deep voice carrying easily through the ship's compartments. "We're not just refugees, we're proof of concept." Whisper shimmered near the ship's sensor array, their energy form providing enhanced scanning capabilities that far exceeded the vessel's aging instruments. "Explain this concept, Thok." "Dr. Chen taught us that humans advanced rapidly because they were willing to form mixed groups, to incorporate alien perspectives into their thinking. They didn't try to remain purely human. They became something new by embracing diversity." Sarah felt a surge of pride at how thoroughly Thok had understood one of her central teaching principles. "Go on." "We're doing the same thing," the Gorian continued. "We're not a reptarian group or a Centaurian group or a human group. We're something that's never existed before, a truly multi-species educational collective." Zictor's scales shifted to brighter patterns as he considered the implications. A group that combines the intellectual approaches of 6 different evolutionary paths. "Exactly," Myra 9 chimed in, their crystalline harmonics expressing excitement. "My people process information through resonance patterns. Zictor's species uses layered analytical frameworks. Thok's people think in terms of physical systems and structural relationships." Whisper's energy field flickered with what Sarah had learned was their equivalent of laughter. "And humans tie it all together with their peculiar talent for seeing connections that shouldn't exist." Pip's voice carried back from the pilot's station, mixing concentration with enthusiasm. "My family always said humans were dangerous because they never stayed in their proper categories. They'd take technologies from 12 different species and combine them into something completely new." "Which is exactly what we're doing with educational methodologies," Sarah realized, the full implications of their situation beginning to crystallize in her mind. "We're not just students and a teacher running away from authority. We're a research team pursuing an entirely new approach to knowledge and learning." The excitement in the ship's atmosphere was almost tangible as each member of their group began to understand the scope of what they were attempting. They weren't just rebels, they were pioneers. "The question," Thok said thoughtfully, "is whether Haven will understand what we're offering them." Pip had been unusually quiet about the details of their destination, claiming that some things were better experienced than explained. But as they approached the hyperspace jump point, the little pilot finally began sharing information that made Sarah's scientific curiosity burn with anticipation. "Haven isn't exactly a research station," Pip explained. "It's more like a collection of individuals who couldn't fit anywhere else in galactic society. Scientists whose theories were too radical, engineers whose designs were too innovative, philosophers whose ideas were too dangerous." "Sounds familiar," Zictor observed dryly, his scales showing patterns of amusement. "The interesting part," Pip continued, "is that they've been successful, really successful. Haven has developed technologies that are decades ahead of anything the major governments possess. They just don't publicize their achievements." Sarah leaned forward in her acceleration couch, her interest sharpening. "What kind of technologies?" "Well," Pip grinned, showing those tiny predators' teeth, "they've solved faster-than-light communication. Not the theoretical framework, actual working instantaneous communication across galactic distances." The shuttle fell silent except for the hum of life support systems. Faster-than-light communication was considered impossible by mainstream galactic physics. The energy requirements alone should have made it impractical, even if the theoretical barriers could be overcome. Myra 9 was the first to speak, their harmonic tones carrying disbelief. "That's impossible. The quantum mechanics alone. That's what the Galactic Physics Council said too, Pip interrupted cheerfully. Right up until Haven demonstrated the technology by having real-time conversations with research teams in the Andromeda Galaxy. Thok's rumbling laugh filled the shuttle. I think I'm going to like this place. There's more, Pip continued, clearly enjoying their audience's attention. They've developed gravity manipulation systems that don't require exotic matter. They've created consciousness transfer protocols that preserve complete personality patterns. They've even built ships that can exist in multiple dimensions simultaneously. Whisper's energy pattern shifted to what Sarah recognized as intense curiosity. How is this possible? Such advances should require massive institutional resources, government funding, decades of collaborative research. That's the point, Pip explained as they initiated the hyperspace jump sequence. Haven proved that small groups of highly motivated individuals can outperform huge bureaucratic institutions. When you remove administrative overhead, political interference, and institutional conservatism, innovation happens much faster. Sarah felt a thrill of anticipation mixed with professional excitement. If what Pip was describing was accurate, Haven represented exactly the kind of educational and research environment she had always dreamed of creating. But why haven't these innovations spread throughout the galaxy, she asked. If they're that advanced, surely. Because Haven maintains strict control over their knowledge sharing, Pip replied as the stars outside the viewport shifted into the characteristic streaks of hyperspace. They only work with individuals who demonstrate genuine commitment to advancement over personal gain. They're very careful about who they trust with truly revolutionary technologies. Zictor's scales showed patterns of concern. And you think they'll accept us? Pip's expression grew serious for the first time since they had begun their journey. That depends entirely on whether we can prove we're worth the risk they'd be taking. As they settled into the hyperspace journey that would take them to their new home, Sarah found herself wondering exactly what kind of proof they would need to provide. They had demonstrated courage by leaving the academy, shown intelligence by executing their escape successfully, and proven their commitment to collaborative learning through their group dynamics. But Haven would likely require something more concrete, some evidence that their educational collective could contribute to the station's research goals while maintaining the security standards that had kept Haven's innovations secret from galactic governments. Pip, Sarah said carefully, when you contacted Haven to arrange our passage, what exactly did you tell them about us? The little pilot's whiskers twitched in what Sarah had learned was either amusement or nervousness. In this case, she suspected both. I told them, Pip said slowly, that I was bringing them the most dangerous educational experiment in galactic history, a human teacher and multi-species student group that had proven impossible for the Galactic Council to control or contain. Sarah felt her stomach drop slightly, and their response was, Pip's grin was equal parts reassurance and warning. They said they'd been waiting for someone exactly like that for about 50 years. As the Wanderer continued its journey through hyperspace toward an uncertain but promising future, Sarah realized that they were about to discover whether their educational experiment was truly as revolutionary as they hoped, or if they were simply the latest group of idealistic refugees to wash up on Haven's shores. Either way, there was no turning back now. They had chosen their path, and whatever waited for them at Kepler 186F would determine whether their leap of faith would become a triumph of independent education, or simply a cautionary tale about the dangers of challenging established authority. Sarah looked around at her companions, these extraordinary young beings who had trusted her enough to risk everything on an uncertain future, and realized that regardless of what they found at Haven, they had already succeeded in the most important way possible. They had proven that knowledge and courage could overcome any institutional barrier when individuals were willing to stand together for principles that mattered more than personal security. Now they would discover what else was possible when such individuals were given the freedom and resources to pursue their dreams without limitation. Kepler 186F appeared on their view screen as a world that defied expectations. Sarah had imagined a harsh mining planet, all industrial complexes and scarred landscapes. Instead, she found herself looking at a world that seemed almost artificially beautiful, with crystalline cities that caught the light from the system's red dwarf star and reflected it in spectacular prismatic displays. Welcome to Haven, Pip announced, their voice carrying a mixture of pride and nervous anticipation. Population approximately 50,000, representing over 200 species from across the galaxy. As the Wanderer descended through the planet's atmosphere, Sarah could see that the surface was dotted with structures that seemed to blend seamlessly with the natural landscape. Geometric buildings grew from cliffsides like crystal formations, while vast transparent domes covered what appeared to be experimental agricultural zones. The mining operations? Thok asked, his deep voice carrying curiosity. Oh, they exist, Pip replied, adjusting their descent vector toward what appeared to be a landing facility carved into the side of a mountain. But they're completely automated. The real work happens in the research complexes. Myra 9 had been monitoring communication frequencies throughout their approach, and their crystalline form was brighter than Sarah had ever seen it. The technological sophistication here is remarkable. I'm detecting energy signatures that shouldn't be possible with conventional physics. That's because they're not using conventional physics, a new voice said from the shuttle's communication system. Welcome to Haven, educational refugees. I am Dr. Zendar, and I'll be evaluating your application for residency. The voice belonged to a species Sarah didn't recognize, though the universal translator rendered it in pleasant, musical tones that suggested advanced vocal capabilities. Dr. Chen, the voice continued, your reputation precedes you. The Galactic Council's decision to remove human educators has been anticipated here for some time. Sarah leaned toward the communication console. Dr. Zendar, I should clarify that my students and I aren't seeking refuge. We're hoping to establish a new kind of educational collective, one that combines diverse species perspectives to achieve breakthroughs impossible within homogeneous institutional structures, Dr. Zendar interrupted smoothly. Yes, we've reviewed Pip's initial report. The question is whether your group can deliver on such ambitious promises. As the shuttle touched down on a landing pad that seemed to be made of some kind of adaptive material that shifted to accommodate their vessel's landing gear, Sarah realized that their real test was just beginning. The airlock opened to reveal a figure that was definitely not from any species Sarah had encountered in her xenobiology studies. Dr. Zendar stood approximately 7 feet tall, with a humanoid build but covered in what appeared to be living scales that shifted color and pattern constantly. Their face was elegantly angular, with large eyes that seemed to contain swirling galaxies and 4 arms that moved with fluid grace. I am a hybrid, Dr. Zendar explained, apparently noticing Sarah's confusion. The result of genetic combination techniques that most galactic governments consider illegal. My parents were from species separated by 40,000 light-years of evolutionary development. Haven made our existence possible. Behind Dr. Zendar stood a collection of beings that was unlike anything Sarah had ever seen. Not just because of the variety of species represented, but because many of them appeared to be modified, enhanced, or hybridized in ways that challenged conventional understanding of biological possibility. This is our evaluation committee, Dr. Zendar continued. We'll be testing your group's collaborative capabilities, innovative thinking, and potential contributions to Haven's research goals. Zictor stepped forward, his scales showing patterns of respectful attention. What kind of tests? A being that appeared to be part energy field and part crystalline matrix answered in harmonics that made Myra 9 chime in resonant response. Practical challenges. Real problems that our research teams have been unable to solve despite significant effort. Another committee member, whose form seemed to shift between different states of matter, added, Success will demonstrate that your educational approach produces results. Failure will indicate that you're simply another group of idealistic individuals with more enthusiasm than capability. Thok's rumbling laugh carried across the landing pad. Sounds fair. We didn't come here to be given anything we hadn't earned. Dr. Zendar's expression, complex emotions crossing features that combined elements from multiple evolutionary paths, suggested approval. Very good. Your first challenge begins immediately. They were led into the mountain complex through corridors that seemed to exist in more dimensions than the standard 3. Sarah found herself occasionally glimpsing spaces that appeared to extend far beyond what the mountain's actual volume could contain. Dimensional folding technology, Whisper observed, their energy pattern flickering with fascination. Space-time manipulation on a scale I've never encountered. One of our more practical innovations, Dr. Zendar replied casually. When you're conducting research that requires massive facilities but need to maintain security, expanding interior space without changing exterior appearance is quite useful. They arrived at a laboratory complex that was breathtaking in its sophistication. Equipment from hundreds of different technological traditions had been seamlessly integrated into workstations that could accommodate beings of vastly different physical requirements. Your challenge, Dr. Zendar announced, involves solving a communication problem that has plagued our research efforts for 3 years. A holographic display activated above a central workstation, showing what appeared to be a vast network of interconnected nodes extending across galactic distances. We've successfully created faster-than-light communication technology, Dr. Zendar explained. However, we've encountered a limitation that our teams cannot overcome. The system works perfectly for species with similar neurological structures, but beings with significantly different consciousness patterns cannot achieve clear communication through our network. Sarah studied the display, her mind immediately beginning to analyze the problem. The communication protocols are optimized for specific types of thought processes. Exactly, another committee member replied. This one appeared to be a collective consciousness inhabiting multiple robotic bodies simultaneously. Each species interprets information through evolutionary-specific frameworks. Our current system can only bridge limited gaps between similar neurological architectures. Myra 9 moved closer to the display, their crystalline form beginning to resonate with frequencies that made the hologram shimmer. What attempts have been made to solve this? Translation algorithms, consciousness mapping, neurological bridging protocols, Dr. Zendar listed. All approaches have focused on converting one species' thought patterns to match another's. None have succeeded in preserving original cognitive structures while enabling clear communication. Pip had been studying the technical specifications displayed around the hologram, their small stature allowing them to examine details that larger beings might miss. This is fascinating. The technology creates quantum entanglement between consciousness fields, but the entanglement degrades when the fields are too dissimilar. Precisely, Dr. Zendar confirmed. We need a solution that enables true multi-species communication without requiring any participant to alter their fundamental thought processes. Sarah looked around at her companions, seeing each of them approaching the problem from their species' unique perspective. This was exactly the kind of challenge that their educational collective was designed to address. How long do we have? She asked. 3 days, Dr. Zendar replied. If you can solve this problem within that time frame, you'll be granted full residency and access to Haven's resources for your educational project. And if we can't? Zichter asked, his scales showing patterns of determination rather than concern. Dr. Zendar's expression was kind but firm. Then you'll be provided with safe passage to any destination within reasonable travel distance, along with our appreciation for the attempt. As the evaluation committee departed, leaving them alone with the most complex technological challenge any of them had ever encountered, Sarah felt a familiar surge of excitement. This wasn't just a test. It was exactly the kind of impossible problem that human nature demanded they solve. Well, Thok rumbled, already moving toward the workstations, I suppose we should get started. Whisper's energy pattern brightened with anticipation. Where do we begin? Sarah looked around at these extraordinary beings who had followed her into an uncertain future, then at the holographic display showing a communication network that could revolutionize galactic civilization if they could overcome its limitations. We begin, she said, by doing what we've always done best. We combine 6 different ways of understanding the universe and see what emerges from the intersection. As her team dispersed to examine different aspects of the challenge, Sarah realized that this moment was the culmination of everything she had taught them about the power of diverse perspectives working in harmony. They had 3 days to prove that their educational experiment could produce results that justified Haven's trust. More importantly, they had 3 days to discover whether their leap of faith would become the foundation for something greater than any of them had dared to imagine. The real test of their principles was about to begin. 47 hours into their 3-day challenge, Sarah's team had achieved something unprecedented. They had failed spectacularly at every conventional approach to the communication problem, and in doing so, had discovered something far more significant than a technical solution. The breakthrough came when they stopped trying to solve the problem, and instead began questioning the fundamental assumptions behind it. "We've been thinking about this wrong," Sarah announced to her exhausted teammates as they gathered around the holographic display for what felt like the 100th time. "Everyone who's attempted this challenge has focused on the communication technology itself." Zictor's scales showed patterns of frustrated curiosity. What other approach is there? The quantum entanglement between consciousness fields requires technological mediation. "Does it?" Whisper asked, their energy form brightening as they began to follow Sarah's reasoning. "Or does it require understanding?" Myra 9 chimed in harmonics that conveyed sudden excitement. "The technology isn't failing because the consciousness fields are too different. It's failing because we're asking it to translate between incompatible conceptual frameworks." Thok leaned back in his specially reinforced chair, his massive frame shifting as understanding dawned. "You're saying the problem isn't technical, it's educational." "Exactly," Pip said, their whiskers twitching with a kind of anticipation that suggested a breakthrough was imminent. "Each species is trying to communicate through the network using their own species-specific logic structures. The technology can't bridge the gap because it's not designed to teach, it's designed to translate." Sarah felt the familiar thrill that came with a paradigm shift, the moment when a seemingly impossible problem suddenly revealed its elegant solution. "What if," she said slowly, "instead of trying to make the technology translate between different consciousness patterns, we teach the consciousness patterns to understand each other?" The laboratory fell silent except for the hum of exotic equipment and the subtle harmonics that accompanied Myra 9's processing cycles. "A consciousness education protocol," Zictor breathed, his scales shifting to patterns Sarah had never seen before, complex spirals of gold and silver that spoke of revolutionary understanding. "Not translation," Thok rumbled, his deep voice carrying growing excitement. "Comprehension, teaching each consciousness field to recognize and interpret the logical structures of other species without abandoning its own patterns." Whisper's energy form began to pulse in rhythm with Myra 9's crystalline resonance. The participants would learn to think multilingually at the consciousness level. "It's like learning a new language," Pip added, their small hands already working at the control interfaces. "Except instead of words and grammar, they're learning thought patterns and reasoning structures." Sarah moved to the central workstation, her mind racing with implications. "We don't need to change the hardware at all. We need to develop educational software that prepares consciousness fields for multi-species communication." What followed was 37 hours of the most intensive collaborative work Sarah had ever experienced. Each team member contributed not just their species' expertise, but their understanding of how their own minds processed information differently from their teammates. Zictor mapped the logical frameworks that his species used for complex analysis, creating models that other consciousness types could learn to recognize and interpret. Myra 9 developed resonance patterns that could teach organic minds to process information in crystalline harmonic structures. Thok designed physical metaphors that translated abstract concepts into spatial relationships that any species could comprehend. Whisper created energy-based exercises that helped corporeal beings understand non-physical reasoning patterns, while Pip developed navigation protocols that taught consciousness fields to find common conceptual ground despite vastly different evolutionary origins. Sarah tied it all together with human pattern recognition skills, finding the connections between different approaches that none of the others could see individually, but all of them understood once she pointed them out. The result was something that had never existed before: a comprehensive educational system for teaching beings to communicate across fundamental differences in consciousness structure. When Dr. Zendar and the evaluation committee returned on the third day, they found Sarah's team demonstrating something that went far beyond solving the original communication problem. "We've created a universal consciousness literacy program," Sarah explained, gesturing to displays showing complex interaction protocols that enabled beings from 6 different species to share thoughts with perfect clarity while maintaining their individual reasoning patterns. The technology works perfectly, Myra 9 added, their crystalline form glowing with achievement. But only after participants complete our educational protocols. Dr. Zendar studied the displays with 4 eyes that seemed to contain swirling galaxies, their expression unreadable. You're claiming that you've solved consciousness-level communication barriers through education rather than technology. We're demonstrating it, Thok replied, activating a communication link that connected him directly to Whisper's energy-based consciousness. The conversation that followed was conducted at thought speed, with perfect comprehension despite the massive differences between their neurological architectures. The implications, Dr. Zendar said slowly, are staggering. Zichter stepped forward, his scales showing patterns of confident pride. Any being in the galaxy could learn to communicate clearly with any other being, regardless of species differences. Not through translation, but through genuine understanding. Pip grinned, showing their tiny predator's teeth. We've created the first universal education system for consciousness development. Dr. Zendar turned to confer with the other committee members in a rapid exchange of communication methods that Sarah's team could now follow perfectly thanks to their new protocols. When the consultation ended, Dr. Zendar's expression had transformed into something that conveyed profound respect. In 3 days, they announced, you have achieved something that our research teams considered impossible after 3 years of effort. More importantly, you've proven that collaborative education can overcome barriers that pure technology cannot address. The hybrid being paused, their forearms moving in gestures that conveyed ceremonial significance. Haven offers you full residency, unlimited access to our research facilities, and complete support for establishing your educational collective as an independent institution within our community. Sarah felt a surge of triumph that was immediately overwhelmed by the magnitude of what they were being offered. We accept, she said, speaking for all of them. There is one additional matter, Dr. Zendar continued. Your consciousness literacy protocols will need to be shared with beings throughout the galaxy. Such knowledge cannot remain secret. Whisper's energy pattern flickered with what Sarah recognized as concern. The Galactic Council won't approve of technology that enables true cross-species understanding. They prefer controlled translation systems that preserve institutional oversight. Dr. Zendar's expression showed the complex emotions possible only to a being whose face combined features from multiple evolutionary paths. Which is why the knowledge must be disseminated through educational channels rather than official technological release. Sarah understood immediately. Underground networks, independent teachers, researcher groups, educational collectives like ours. Exactly, Dr. Zendar confirmed. Haven has maintained its independence by ensuring that revolutionary knowledge spreads through channels that governments cannot control or contain. Zichter's scales shifted to patterns of excited determination. We become teachers again, but this time we're teaching something that could transform galactic civilization. Myra 9's harmonics carried pure joy. We'll need to train other educational collectives, establish communication protocols between independent research groups, create learning materials that can be adapted for any species. Thok's rumbling laugh filled the laboratory. So we've gone from being educational refugees to becoming the foundation for a new kind of galactic education system. Pip's whiskers twitched with satisfaction. I told you humans were dangerous. They never stay in their proper categories. As Sarah looked around at her companions, these extraordinary beings who had trusted her enough to risk everything on principles they believed in, she realized that they had succeeded beyond their wildest dreams. They had not only proven that diverse perspectives could overcome impossible barriers, but they had created something that would enable countless other beings throughout the galaxy to experience the same kind of breakthrough understanding. The Galactic Council had told the human to go, expecting that removing her influence would preserve their carefully controlled educational systems. Instead, they had inadvertently launched an educational revolution that would spread far beyond any institution's ability to contain. Dr. Zendar's forearms moved in what Sarah was learning to recognize as a gesture of profound respect. Welcome to Haven, Dr. Chen. Welcome to the future of education. Sarah smiled, surrounded by beings who had become more than students, more than colleagues. They had become proof that the universe was far more wonderful and full of possibility than any bureaucratic institution could imagine. "Thank you," she replied. "We're ready to begin." 6 months later, as Sarah stood in the observation deck of Haven's newest research facility, she watched shuttles arriving daily carrying educational refugees from across the galaxy. Word had spread through unofficial networks about a place where diverse minds could work together without institutional interference, where knowledge was pursued for its own sake rather than bureaucratic approval. Her original team had become the core faculty of what was now called the Collaborative Intelligence Institute. They had trained dozens of other multi-species educational groups, each developing their own specializations while sharing the fundamental principles of consciousness literacy. The Galactic Council had issued official statements condemning unsanctioned educational activities and warning citizens about the dangers of uncontrolled knowledge sharing. Their warnings were ignored. Beings throughout the galaxy had discovered that understanding each other was far more valuable than following institutional guidelines. Sarah touched the communication device that connected her to former students now teaching on dozens of worlds throughout the galaxy. The consciousness literacy protocols had spread far beyond Haven, enabling the kind of genuine cooperation between species that had previously been impossible. The human had indeed gone, but she had taken the future with her, and it was beautiful. As Zictor approached with reports of 3 new educational collectives requesting training, his scales showing the deep contentment patterns that indicated perfect satisfaction with life choices made, Sarah realized that sometimes the best thing authority could do for innovation was to try to stop it. The cubs had gathered their belongings and followed. Now they were building something that would outlast any government that tried to contain it. And throughout the galaxy, other humans and their students were doing the same thing, one consciousness-expanding lesson at a time.